Hello and welcome to this revision session on your GCSE English language extract analysis. It can be of mice and men or mockingbird. And in this session I'm going to focus on something that sounds quite complex but is really quite simple, and that's what is an analytical adverb. Now the exam is all about reading between the lines and really trying to explain that you understand what the author is really trying to say about life and man and violence and relationships. And it's up to your teacher to help you explore those ideas. But what I'm trying to do with this is to show you a really good skill and way and technique to make your writing stand out to the examiner and show a real understanding, even if it's not there, of how to trace the patterns of the language and to evaluate what the author is actually trying to do. But obviously the big question is, what is it? What does it look like? How can you use it? So let's get on with that. Now here we've got a sentence stem that's typical of a C grade, B grade student. Steinbeck uses imagery to make Lenny seem blah blah blah. And it's good, but it's not quite to the core of what the technique that's being used, and doesn't show an opinion on the technique. So this is how you put in your analytical adverb. Here's another simple one. The author uses repetition to reinforce the idea that George is blah blah blah, or that Jem is blah blah blah. But again, it's missing the analytical adverb. And lastly, there you can see another sentence stem. The reader can see that George is a father-like figure through the author's clever use of metaphor or whatever it is. Good, solid writing, focused on the author, focused on the reader, focusing on language, but just missing out this word, which I'm about to show you right now. And here it is. There's the first example I showed you already. Steinbeck uses imagery to make Lenny seem blah blah blah. Instead of just saying that, you say Steinbeck cleverly uses imagery to make Lenny seem. And what that does is you're offering your opinion and analysis of the type of language he uses, not just identifying it, but saying its effect, saying that it's a clever idea. And there's a whole range of words and adverbs you can use that will straight away and very simply give the examiner a really solid idea of what you're like as a student, and that you really understand that language is an art form, and how the author has chosen their ideas and chosen words and to create something that is particularly effective, and that's why it's now studied. So that's the first example. And another good example here, instead of just saying the author uses repetition, you can say the author subtly uses repetition to show the understanding of the way it's been used. Again, that's a particularly effective one and good one to use, but you need to make sure that the use is subtle. And obviously if it's an idea is repeated 5 or 6 times, that's not subtle, but twice, 3 times, that is. And again, it just makes such a difference in terms of the impression that it would make on the examiner. And the last example here, instead of saying the reader can see that George is as a father-like figure through the use of metaphor, you can say the reader can see that George is a father-like figure through the author's clever use of metaphor or imaginative use of metaphor. And again, it's just that little comment on the technique that shows a good level of analysis. Now there's not much more to it than that. It's just a matter of now practicing it, and write your line as you normally would, and then to insert the analytical adverb. But there are 2 different ways you can phrase it. So let's just have a look at that. So you can have the line where you say the author's clever use of rhyme, like subtle use of rhyme instead of subtly. You can use clever instead of cleverly, and it's all quite self-evident here, as you can see in the examples. It's just different ways of phrasing it to mix it up, so your sentences aren't always the same. You can refer to the author directly or just as an author and just throw it in that way. Now there are a lot of alternatives you could use. Some are quite general, others are very specific, so you need to be careful with that, and we'll have a look at a top 10 now. Now cleverly is one of the most common ones. It's one that my students use a lot, and again it should show an understanding, your understanding, that the idea is quite imaginative, that the language device used is quite an interesting idea and should be used specifically for that. And creatively is pretty much the same. Again, these can be used for poetry, not just your prose in your literature paper. Use them when you're analysing your poems, or Animal Farm, or Jekyll and Hyde, whatever it is. Anytime you're analysing any sort of text, even if it's non-fiction, you can use these kind of analytical adverbs to really show a good level of analysis. Number 3, repeatedly is a good one. Obviously, don't say repeatedly uses repetition, because you're just repeating yourself, really. But the author's repeated use of alliteration or sibilants, and again, you're seeing and showing the patterns. And that's a brilliant one for poetry in terms of if his repeated use of a kind of a melancholic tone shows that the author feels or the poet feels. Really very simple use of language yourself, and it works really, really well in the exam. Now, I'm not going to talk through each one, but thoughtfully again is another one you can possibly use. Perceptively again is an idea where they're underneath the surface, perceptive use of a metaphor, for example. Effectively is good in terms of just showing that the idea is concrete, that it worked. Subtly again is something where there's a light touch on something, it's kind of hinted at. And imaginatively again showing the understanding of the author's creativity. Again, if there's humour used, particularly in Mice and Men's, a lot of humour in there, the author's humorous use of irony or whatever. And then clearly again is a very generic, general one, but can be still quite effective to use. So I hope that really helps. As I say, practice writing as you would normally do, and look for those opportunities to insert the analytical adverb in whichever form you like, and try and think about varying it, so you're not using cleverly or clearly all the time, and you're using more specific adverbs that I think will really show the examiner that you're a really good student of language and can understand it and can see the patterns within it.